Thank you very much indeed. It really is a joy to be with you all. I mean, I sound so impressive in my introduction. And of course, what's interesting about introductions is they on the whole speak to things we do, which is right and proper. But of course, if you ask me who I really am, then there are 1,000 answers we could give about ourselves. You know, I'm a person who loves the Lord Jesus, right? Let's start with that one. That's very basic. I'm blessed to have a wonderful wife. So I'm a husband. My wife's called Leslie, and a son called Luke, who's now married to Samantha. I'm passionate about dogs. And I support Liverpool Football Club. It's rather nice hearing about Liverpool here and I've got to worry about them tomorrow. So, you know, there are lots of identities we have, but my identity this morning is to acknowledge a deep sense of gratitude for the privilege of this invitation. And can I just say that I admire your bishop a great deal, her witness in the church, her advocacy for inclusion, and her thoughtful read of the moment we're in are true gifts to us all. So thank you, Bishop, for your ministry. Thanks. So for those of you in the room, and perhaps in a link in the chat, there's a handout so you can follow along what I'm going to say. It's my practice, to the irritation of my students, to start everything with a joke. So let me explain why I start with a joke. I think Jesus was a very funny man, right? And there are lots of reasons for thinking that. I think there are hints of humor throughout the Gospels. I also think that, you know, in Luke, where there's a comparison between John the Baptist and people are saying, look, Jesus, you go to too many parties, you've been seen drinking, you hang out with the wrong people, and Jesus turns around and says, look, John the Baptist was the opposite of me, and you gave him grief, and now you're giving me grief. So you have that sort of sense that Jesus was a person who's very vivacious, very present. And I think the best illustration of Jesus' humor is actually in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, do not judge other people, Jesus says. It's a bit like walking up to somebody and saying, excuse me, Megan, you've got a speck of wood in your eye when there's a whacking great big plank of wood in your own eye. That was a knee slapper. People were saying, Jesus, that's so funny. You know, that was a funny joke. It's a funny image. So if you think of the elephant jokes, they're very similar to Jesus's image humor, right? So how do you know there's an elephant in the refrigerator? Well, that's easy. Footprints in the butter. How do you know there are 2 elephants in the refrigerator? Well, 2 sets of footprints in the butter. How do you know there are 3 elephants in the refrigerator? And at this point, you might think there's a pattern, and you'll go 3 sets, but oh no, you can't close the door. How do you get 4 elephants into a compact car? Well, that's easy, 2 in the back, 2 in the front. How do you know when 4 elephants have been trying to get into a refrigerator? Compact car parked outside. So image jokes, I think, was very much where Jesus' humor was. I don't know about you, but being Episcopalian can sometimes feel a little lonely. You know, you're in an area which is, you know, large, about 1/3 of the population is Roman Catholic. And then you have significant groups of non-denominational groups. And I checked with perplexity, the Episcopal Church in central New York comes in at number 7. So behind the Methodists and the Lutherans. So you can sort of feel a bit lonely, and you can sort of think, oh my goodness, I'm worried about grandchildren and my children, and they're not as committed as I was when I was their age, and you can have all these sorts of anxieties. But I'm here to say, I think this is our moment. I think the Episcopal Church is in for a good season. And let me just identify 3 reasons why I think that's the case. The first thing, we've got to be careful with this data because the truth about this data is that we don't want to be stronger simply because other strands of Christianity in America are weaker. That's not in the spirit of Jesus. But it is just true that our Southern Baptist friends are in precipitous decline, right? Dramatic decline. I mean, faster than any decline we've seen, even through the schism with the Anglican Church in North America. So from 2007, their percentage of the population went from 23% down to 13%. Now, we, in that same period, also declined, along with the other mainline Protestant denominations, from 18% down to 13%. But what's interesting is there's evidence that over the last 2 years, the mainline numbers are now stabilizing, and our fundamentalist friends are continuing to decline. There are a whole host of complicated reasons why this seems to be happening, but it does mean that actually people are looking again at the Episcopal Church and what we stand for and what our witness is. So, you know, think carefully about those stats. They're more complicated than they appear when you hear headline numbers like, in 30 years, given the aging of our population in congregations, we will have disappeared. I've been hearing in 30 years the Episcopal Church will disappear for the last 60 years. I'm 63. And, you know, they keep telling me we're going to disappear. We're still here. You know, we're more robust than people think we are. So that's the first piece of data I'm going to share. The second is, and this is true of all families of faith, we're needed. I think one of the most disturbing pieces of data was actually captured by the US Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, when he wrote that report on the crisis of loneliness. Up to 50% of American adults report feeling lonely. And the health effects of loneliness are significant. It's equivalent to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. And I list on the handout, you know, a high risk of heart disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, and often premature death. So what's going on? Well, there are a couple of things going on. Right back in the 1980s, Bowling Alone by Putnam documented a trend in urban America more than rural America, where people stopped joining things. So in other words, what happened was people don't mind a restaurant where you get a service, and they don't mind a movie theater where you watch a movie, but to actually join something which you have to then help organize and give to, oh no, Americans found that harder and harder. And that's impacted every social organization, you know, Freemasons, all of them have felt decline as people are more reluctant to join things. And then, of course, social media, the internet, right? You can sit in a restaurant and you can watch people sit in close proximity to each other on devices. And you go, well, you might as well just eat by yourself if you're not going to talk to each other, for heaven's sake, you know? So that's a major phenomenon. And the art of conversation, you know, it's always good to have a couple of things in your back pocket as conversation starters. So my favorite is you can have a dinner party with 4 guests from anywhere around the world, any time in history. Who would you pick? And of course, the right answer is St. Paul. I've got a couple of things I need to talk to him about. I'm going to pick St. Thomas Aquinas, a great theologian of the 13th century. I'm going to pick Taylor Swift. Yes, I'm a Swiftie. And I'm going to pick Mohamed Salah, who plays for Liverpool. Okay, I'm not sure if this dinner party is going to work in terms of languages, but nevertheless, it'll be quite interesting. Or another one, which I always think is a good conversation starter, is when you turn to somebody and say, pick 6 pivotal scenes from your life that has made you the person you are? That's a great conversation starter. And it's a great thing, exercise just in your own life to go, okay, what would I pick? So I'll give you one scene from my life. So when I was 8 years old, I was born into the Exclusive Brethren, right? So this is a cult, really, which taught total separation from the world. So the only things I did with other people outside the cult was go to school. I wasn't allowed to go to a neighbor's house. They weren't allowed to come to my house. We had no TV, we had no radio, we had no newspapers. We had church on Sunday, 6 a.m., 9, 12, 3, 6. And my father had a growing family. I'm one of 6 children. Girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. I'm very organized. I'm one of the persecuted number 4s. Middle children always have the hardest time. And my father got to a point where he realized he couldn't stay in the sect any longer for economic reasons. He couldn't make a living, even though he was a trained pharmacist. So I just happened to be with him when he rang up his father and his siblings and his cousins, and he said they were leaving. And he knew as he had those conversations that he would never see them again, and never did. And they never spoke to us ever again. And he took the family out. The only people he knew was the family. He didn't know anybody else beyond the family. Anyway, that's a pivotal scene, okay? That's the sort of thing you discover when you really go into conversations with some depth to try and understand another person. But anyway, social media has eroded all that because we all like producing ChatGPT portraits in the style of Roy Lichtenstein. I've got a very nice one of your bishop, incidentally. So you can do all those things. It's an amazing device that you can play with. And then the third reason is COVID. So the first is the erosion of civic organizations. The second is social media and the internet. And the third is COVID's been huge because we had a season, 2 years, of required isolation. And people had just found it difficult to come back from that. And Episcopalians have found it especially difficult to come back from that because we got accustomed to a Sunday morning when we went to the Church of the Holy Comforter and pulled the comforter back up over yourself as you nestle down and skip the service. So you've got all this going on, and now you've got human lives that have lost the skill of connecting with other human beings. And as a result, we've got a health crisis. So church has to meet a need, a very fundamental practical need. And then the last reason why I think we're going to be on a roll for a season is because one thing I think we're slowly learning culturally in the United States and in the Western world and throughout the world, come to that, is one of the silliest worldviews on planet Earth is the view that all we are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere and are going nowhere. You know, reductionist atheism is totally impossible to live. You know, it's an absurd worldview when you think about it. So all we are and all everything is are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere, going nowhere. You can call it naturalism, you can call it materialism in the sense that all there is matter. Now, this worldview is very unlikely to be true. I mean, the first problem with it is just think for a moment of somebody you love, and then equate that person with the words and all they are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere going nowhere. You suddenly find a disconnect. No, I don't treat that person in that way. I don't actually feel that way about that person. In fact, I feel differently. See, most atheists are really theists without knowing they are, okay? So you start there, and then you think, okay, how can I trust reason if it's just the random mutations of molecules? I mean, how can you appreciate art and music and laughter even, you know, if that's all it is? But the big problem with materialism is mind. If I ask you now, create a picture of Thanksgiving, and you create this picture in your mind and you think about turkeys and mashed potatoes and friendly friends and family gathered around, that picture will never be found by any scientific machine analyzing the brain, because mind is different from matter. It's clearly linked and dependent, because there's this matter deteriorates. I can't quite remember things. Why am I in this room? I came in for a reason. So that's true. There's clearly a link, but it's still a different substance. It's a different entity. Mind is different from matter. So materialism's just false. And do you know what? I think people are starting to realize that. People are starting to think, yes, it isn't true to say that we're just matter. And if we're not just matter, then what are we? Well, the Christian claim is we're persons in a universe intended by God to learn how to give and receive love. That's the Christian claim. And that narrative makes a great deal more sense than the materialistic narrative. Okay, so 3 reasons why I think this could be a great moment. One is there's a reaction against fundamentalist forms of Christianity that we can run with. The second is we're needed. We are a sort of crucial, more than a band-aid, but we're certainly at least that. We're a potential cure to the crisis of loneliness in our moment. And thirdly, our claim about the nature of the universe is more plausible than ever before, and people are starting to see that. So let's think a little bit about what's our secret juice that's going to enable us to actually make a compelling vision of who we are to the world and neighborhoods, to the neighborhoods that we seek to serve. And I want to suggest 3 features at the bottom of the handout. Okay, so as I just shared, I grew up in the exclusive brethren, which meant that there was no liturgy. What was strange about a non-liturgical tradition, though, is that actually each Sunday people came up with the same prayers. They just weren't very good ones. You know, they would just stand up and they would just say the same thing most weeks. You know, you go, okay, yep, that's what you did last week, Mr. Burr. So, you know, people in the end do, these non-liturgical traditions actually develop a liturgy, because in the end, most of us, even when we're doing a spontaneous prayer for somebody we love, all of us end up with certain stock phrases that become part of our prayers as we share them with others. And that's always true in every tradition. The great thing about the Episcopal Church is we just spend some time drawing on some of the most beautiful poetic expressions, going back to Cranmer, that becomes part of the prayers we share with each other in our public worship. But the liturgy is, you know, so let's think of the Eucharistic service for a moment. You know, so the first thing you do when you walk into church on a Sunday is there'll be a certain color theme. So you pause and you say, okay, I'm in a certain season. We're in ordinary time. And we're coming up to New Year. Now remember, January 1st is not New Year for a Christian. It's Advent 1 is our New Year party. Okay, don't worry about January, just ignore it. You have your big party day before Advent 1, okay, because that's the start of the New Year. Now, what's the power of the church calendar? See, most people live life sort of, rolling out of bed, thinking about exercising, a healthy breakfast, go to work, come home, sit down, watch TV, go to bed, get up in the morning, have a healthy breakfast, think about exercise, but not get to it. This is my life, incidentally. And it becomes a routine which is almost unthinking. But the gift of the church calendar is we suddenly elevate ourselves to the walk through the year with Jesus. We anticipate the birth in Advent. We acknowledge the global significance of Christ in Epiphany. We start the journey in Lent to Jerusalem. We walk Holy Week with Christ. We celebrate the resurrection of Easter. We have the coming of the Spirit. And we recognize now the obligation of discipleship in ordinary time. And suddenly you're lifted out of the mundane routine to acknowledge the extraordinary gift of every day and locate life in the context of the eternal. And then you move into the opening acclamation, the collect for the day will pick up on the season of the church. And then you go through the discipline of the 3 words. So the written word we listen to, the epistle, the Old Testament lesson, the psalm, the eternal word. We believe that God was in Christ. The eternal word was present. God reveals the very word of God in Christ. So we encounter the embodied word. And then you come out of that and you go into the preaching of the word, the proclaimed word. So written, eternal, proclaimed. And what do? You learn of God from all that. You learn something of who the source of the universe is, because after all, we're pretty small and the universe is pretty big. And we need God to tell us what God is like. And then you come out of that and you are able to enter the presence of God and pray, because you know that God is looking forward to receiving your prayers. And we bring our brokenness and come out of that into the peace. And we come out of that into the sacrament of the Eucharist. Now, so much goes on. I'm just going to give you a couple of moments which I think are pivotal and really important in congregations to make sure that people understand what's going on. Okay, the thing about the past is you can't change it. So when you're 3, that's sort of okay, yes, because, when you're 3, your past has been pretty uncomplicated, hopefully. When you're 63, which I am, the journey of life has had many twists and turns. I've done things I'm ashamed of. I've done things that are good. So we all come to every moment with the past. And of course, the past is often, for many of us, like a huge shadow. Because the thing about the past is that it can, if you're damaged in the past, you end up being damaging in the present. So the past can't be changed, and yet it's got to be confronted. And in the liturgy on a Sunday morning, there are 3 moments when we confront the past. The first moment's that moment of confession. That's where you just say, okay, Lord, I know that the purpose of living a life is to learn how to love, to give and receive love, but I find it difficult. And this week, this month, now, I'm just too easy to lose my temper. I just find it too difficult to release a grudge. I find it impossible to come to terms with the hurt I feel. Whatever it is, and you say, okay, I bring my brokenness to you and I ask for forgiveness. And actually in the confession, you deal with the past as a person who's done things that are damaging. So you're dealing with the past in the ways in which you've related with others, and you have been the source of pain and hurt to others. And then you get to the peace. Now, I know in smaller congregations, the peace is like the longest part of the service. You know, you've got to get round, you've got to hug everybody. It's often a nice chit-chat time. How are you? I've been worried about you. Are you okay? Right? So it's a beautiful time in all sorts of ways. But theologically, it's very important. So when does the peace come? It comes just before the offertory. What does that remind you of? Well, that reminds you of that passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, before you make your offering, go and make sure you're at peace with your neighbor. So what goes on? So if the confession is where we are agents of hurt to others, the peace is where we say, Lord, I ask you to bring the peace of Christ into those places where I'm still hurt by others. In other words, in the symbolism of the peace of the Lord be always with you. Thank you very much. In the symbolism of the exchanging of the peace, you're actually saying, Lord God, I'm still hurting because my parents neglected me. I'm still hurting because I was married and we ended up getting divorced and I'm still in pain. I'm still hurting because 2 months ago, I thought I was going to get that job, but they gave it to somebody else. I'm still hurting because a sibling just said something way out of order. And of course, the interesting thing about this, our inability to forgive, our inability to receive the peace of Christ, is that actually the people who hurt us have long since forgotten they did. And they're just off doing their stuff. You know, they're just off doing whatever. But we're still living with the pain, and that pain is having an impact on the joy of the present. So in the confession, we acknowledge our agency as people who do things wrong. In the peace, we seek the power to forgive those who did wrong to us. And then there's one more moment in the liturgy, which is extraordinarily powerful, and it's easy to miss. And you do need to learn to read the service. It's actually, you have the Great Thanksgiving. The Great Thanksgiving is a funny name for that prayer, isn't it, really? You know, Great Thanksgiving? I mean, excuse me, we're giving thanks for the Roman authorities taking a relatively young life at 33. That is like weird, weird, weird. I mean, you know, what on earth are we doing here? But of course, we're doing it because learning to be grateful is one of the most powerful gifts that our liturgy gives us. And learning to find a way to be grateful about the tragic is a sign of deep holiness. You know, the interesting thing about the Great Thanksgiving, the journey starts, it depends on which Eucharistic prayer, but journey starts, and of course, EOW's enlarged the list, but the journey starts with creation and with the disclosure that God is love, the source of everything that is, who reveals God's expectations of humanity through the prophets and then culminating in Jesus of Nazareth. And then we flow into, you know, we remember the significance of Jesus born of a virgin, the disclosure of the eternal word to humanity. We go into all that, and then, of course, we narrate this guy being betrayed by friends and dying on a cross. We narrate that. And it's called the Great Thanksgiving. So sure, it's easy to stare at a New England fall and marvel at the beauty of the colors and be grateful. And sure, it's easy to be grateful when we are conscious that we're loved by the creator of everything that is, and as a result, loved by others, and that's gift. It's harder to be thankful when you encounter tragedy, death, illness, decline. But the invitation is to see grace in it all. And what's interesting is it culminates. So you get to the end of the prayer, you do the Lord's Prayer, and then the rubrics in the Book on Prayer are really interesting. So the person presiding at the table will break the consecrated host. And it is a very strict rubric, which I urge you, if you're musicians or priests, just insist, you're a musician or whatever, you really pause at the fraction. So the body of Christ is broken. The symbolism of the fraction is that in brokenness, God's grace can be found. In the hardest moments, grace can be found. In the most painful moments, grace can be found. So, I became an Anglican. So I was in this cult until I was 8. And then we sort of floated around in evangelical congregations for a bit. I became a Baptist. And then I discovered the Anglican tradition, the Church of England, when I was at King's College London. And it was as I was thinking about the liturgy and the work that you're required to do in the liturgy, that's literally what the word means, the work of the people. So as I was thinking about that, it dawned on me one day, the purpose of the fraction is for me revisit some of the most painful moments of my life and say, okay, Lord, I need to see your grace present in that moment. So my mother died when I was 19. And she fell ill in the December and she died in the October. And I did not handle it well. And my schoolwork in the UK, you have to do A-levels to get into university, just went. And so I failed my A-levels, which meant I was not able to go straight on to university. And I got the result in the August. And I went to find my mother. And there she was with cancer ripping through her body. And an illness isolates you, understandably. It's difficult to look beyond yourself when you're really suffering. And to her enormous credit, it was like she just forgot everything about herself. And she reached out to this, gosh, I'm going to lose it if I'm not careful. She reached out to her fragile teenage son and just reassured me that I was loved. And as I look back on that moment, I see God's grace. In what was a hard moment for me, I saw the very grace of God. And that's the symbolism of things broken. And yet, even in the hardest of moments, there's grace there. Sometimes you've got to search for it. Sometimes it's hard to see. But the God of love is not absent from these moments. God is there right in the heart and in the center. So my case this morning is this, really. I want us to believe in the tradition of which we're a part. I want us to celebrate the congregations to which we belong. I want us to believe, not in a wishful thinking way, but really believe that God is going to do great things here in central New York. And the season's just so ripe for it. You know, in the end, materialism makes no sense. You know, the enthusiasm in our urban centers for secularization and atheism, you know, it was always an implausible metaphysic. It's not surprising that there's always been a minority strand of the world who, historically and today, who flirt with such a metaphysic. So we've got our witness, you know, selling God and explaining why God is not as hard as we all think it is. There's a narrative that's compelling and rational and persuasive. And most people live like it. Most people live in that place. But then the second reason is because we've got a mission field of isolated, lonely Americans who need to get to know people. You know, I'm a great fan of programming that gets people into a church, but not necessarily for a service. So the steps are, you know, persuade them to come to this parish, incidentally, did a fabulous dinner last night. It was really nice. You know, so get them to come to a dinner. And then, you know, as humans, two humans connect and they say, okay, you're fun to be with. I've enjoyed the conversation. This is what Episcopalians aren't very good at, but do try it. You issue the invitation to come to a service. But you make it really easy. You say, look, I'll wait at the front door for you. I'll sit next to you. I know we're really confusing. We stand up in funny places. We sit down in funny places. We kneel. Some people do one thing. Other people do another thing. You've got 3 books to juggle. Sometimes it's S102, and you're thinking, where's the S? So you go through, you make it easy because you're going to sit next to them. You're going to make sure that this is accessible. And then that person suddenly realizes that they have somebody they can call up. They can ask that the other person will pray for them. You know, so human connection. You know, we need to do our bit to actually confront the scourge of loneliness. And sure, we've got to educate in our congregations how to talk to each other again and get to know each other again and share a hobby again. You know, that's all part of it. That's all part of the work in this moment. And then we do need, you know, so I grew up playing cricket, okay, and soccer, except we called it football. And so when I moved to the United States in 2001, and incidentally, just to reassure you all, I am an American citizen. I actually did forswore potentates. Do you know, I must admit, I didn't look at what I had promised to do until I got to the actual swearing in. I stood there for a good, 30 seconds, staring at the word potentate and thinking, what does that mean? Is that a reference to Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth? I mean, she's the least potentate person I've ever met. But anyway, the rule is you have to say it. So I did. And where am I going with this? I'm a citizen. Thank you for reassuring me. Yes. And we, but I wasn't going there, was I? Sorry? Oh, cricket. Thank you. That's a gift. Okay, cricket's the weirdest game on planet Earth, right? You know, it can go on for 5 days and end in a draw. I mean, any game like that's got problems. And it's a hard ball. I mean, it's like hard. But, you know, when I moved to America, what I had to do was learn, and I love baseball. I love American football. You know, I think these are great games, very fascinating games. But of course, you do need somebody who sits next to you in a baseball game and says, that's the third base. The bases are loaded. You know, you need somebody who explains the rules and explains why this is happening next and why that's happening next. And if you don't have somebody doing that, it's just a bizarre ritual. You know, you get to the 7th innings shuffle and you wonder what on earth's going on. It's the same with any human practice. Any human practice needs a guide. You know, if you go around an art gallery with somebody who's immersed themselves in the art of Monet or whatever, the Impressionist, you'll get more out of that half hour listening to your friend talk about the art than you will if you walk around 1,000 times by yourself. So we all need a guide to understand a practice. And one of the challenges in the Episcopal Church is once you're inside the practices of the Episcopal Church, it's life transforming. It makes you healthier, it makes you stronger, makes you all together more effective. I mean, it's amazing what church can do. There's a reason why people who go to church outlive their secular neighbors by years. There's no question about that. That's a settled piece of data now for decades old. And the interesting thing about that data is people keep questioning it because social scientists are a secular bunch and they do another test. And the result's always the same. It's a minimum of 2 years if you're an occasional Episcopalian, right? And it's if you go 3 times a week or more, there are some studies that imply you outlive your secular neighbor by 7 years. Now, 3 times or more a week in an Episcopal church is a bit of a challenge. But, you know, that means, you know, Monday morning, Sunday, I mean, and then perhaps a choir, and then perhaps a Bible study, whatever it is. But the health benefits of church are huge. But we do need to work hard. And I say this to the clergy here. Work hard at explaining the symbolism of the liturgy. Be that guide to those who are either occasional or new. And from time to time, step right back and say, and certainly if you do confirmation classes or you do new member classes, all those things, make sure a key part of it is a great training in the liturgy. And I think we're in a moment which is really hopeful. I think there are, it depends on us. You know, it's work. It won't just happen. We've got to think about who we are, what we are. We've got to take advantage of opportunities to talk to people and persuade them to come along to this or that. So yeah, that's crucial too. But I think we're in for a good season. And I invite us all to be part of it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was wonderful. This morning, the clergy, some of the clergy, we had some questions.
Yes.
And so this is like a fast round. So you talked about, you started off with humor. In this time, how might humor and playfulness merge with this very serious, challenging time? How might that be utilized in this time?
Yeah. So yes, humor is a resource. So it's interesting. If it's true that Jesus is the eternal word, right? Jesus is So, but eternal word is a metaphor, obviously, Johannine metaphor from John's Gospel. So, you know, if I say every morning I have Weetabix and bananas for my breakfast cereal, you'll say, well, there's Weetabix probably. Weetabix is like lumps of cardboard, really. But I do. But at least what I've done with those words is I've communicated to you my thoughts. So when we say the eternal word is in Christ, Christ is the eternal word, we're saying the embodied Christ is the very thought of God amongst us. It's an extraordinary claim. You know, when people say, how do you know what God is like? The answer is very simple. I know what God is like because I look at Christ. And Christ is the very thought of God embodied. Okay. And if Christ was funny, which I think he was, I mean, you know that parable, you know, which of you would not leave 99 sheep to go and find one? That was clearly funny, right? Because they're all bright enough to work out. No, you wouldn't actually do that. Because it's really unwise to leave 99 sheep just meandering around. They don't all stay together. So Jesus was a very funny person. Therefore, humor is of God, and humor is part of the armory that we all have to cope with living in life. And humor, like any human, like sex, like thinking, like, you know, art, like, it can be misused, it can be cruel, it can be unkind, it can be racist, it can be deeply offensive. But humor used to witness to irony, a different way of looking at something, a way of coping with something can be very powerful, you know, and it is just true that actually you see entire cultures using humans. You see it amongst African Americans in the 19th century around the evil institution of slavery. You see it amongst Jewish people as they were moved on in early 20th century Europe. You know, it becomes a genre all of its own as a mechanism of coping with everything that's happening. So I do encourage you all to laugh. And actually laughing makes the other less powerful. So do use humor. It's a tool that God gives us in our armory to cope with the most stressful of things, including the moment we're living through as a country.
Thank you. How are you seeing theological education change, and what might be helpful for us to know about that?
Yeah. So can I just make a quick plug for the two institutions I run? Can I also plead with you, raise up vocations? You know, one of the problems I'm having is I run both General and Virginia, and I get lots of complaints about the fact that there are insufficient seniors to fill vacancies around this country of ours. You know, we really are in a moment when, I'll tell you what happened. About 25 years ago, 30 years ago, bishops primarily, much as I love them all, thank you, just reassuring you.
It's all right. We get that often. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. But bishops started assuming that the decline was so severe, there wouldn't be jobs for people they sent to seminary. And what has actually happened is that although we've declined, the decline of vocations is faster. So we've got this gap where we're actually fulfilling our own decline prophecy, because there are lots of congregations which can afford clergy, which can't have them. So there are 6,000 plus congregations in the Episcopal Church, of which about 2,500 can afford a clergy person. Now, that's not mainly ASA dependent, average Sunday attendance. That's actually additional income streams. So a school or a parking lot sometimes, or whatever it is, an endowment obviously is great. which enables, and certainly if two congregations nearby partner, again, you can have a clergy person. So there's actually lots of spaces, but there are insufficient people. So do be very alert in your congregations to whoever you know, who you say, okay, this person could sit by the bed of somebody dying. This is a person who could bring the word to the world in which we're living. Do just sort of say, I want you to be willing to raise up that vocation. Okay, so theological education, how is it changing? Well, we have two modes of delivery, which is a difference. Once upon a time, it was all residential, but now it's not just all residential, there's a hybrid option. So let me talk about the hybrid. This is for those who can't move for lots of good reasons. So how do you create a high quality experience? Well, you insist on some presence, right? That's important. So we require every student at the General Theological Seminary to be there for 3 residential weeks. And you make sure the online experience is imaginative and nicely done. So you ask Rowan Williams, for example, sitting in Wales, taught Anglican theology to the students at GTS. Right, so they gather for an intensive in August, online with Rowan in the fall, intensive in January, online with, so I'm teaching just at the minute, forgiveness and social justice with Empo Tutu, the daughter of Desmond Tutu. So I'm teaching with her, so that class in the spring, and then another intensive on the close. And it's a good way of being trained. And then down in Alexandria, both programs, incidentally, are tuition free, and the scholarship in Alexandria includes tuition, your accommodation, and a meal plan. So all of that is with the goal of encouraging families to live, on the campus for 3 years. And of course, it's a different experience. You're in close proximity with people who form you for holy orders. And I do think that theological education is really important. I mean, you would expect me to say that. But also, I think in a very healthy season. And the important skills one needs to learn is, sure, you need to know your way around Scripture. Sure, you need to know how to articulate the faith in terms of your theology. Sure, you need to know how it relates to the world in terms of your ethics. And sure, you need to know how to engage with polarization. You need to know how to engage with congregational dynamics. You need to know how to engage with the pastoral care of the souls in your care. That remains the heart of the program. But I think the biggest change is probably modalities. More modalities are emerging, and that's a good thing.
Can you explain what modalities are for people who may not know?
Sorry, I lapsed into educational speak. Modalities means different modes of learning. So you have a full residential, which is, so at Alexandria, every student's expected to go to one corporate act of worship, and most go to the morning Eucharist. Every student's required to go to lunch. That's important because, of course, it's over the lunch table when you sit opposite somebody you really don't get on with. They just ended up sitting opposite you. And that's important because we need to be able to cope with difference in our tradition. And then you obviously go to class. So that's a residential way of learning. And then the hybrid is part online, part in person.
Thank you. So what are some theological issues that Episcopalians need to be formed around?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, all the biggies. I get really annoyed when people say to me, I hate Trinity Sunday and I don't really know how to preach on it. I say, give me a break. You were trained in the great theological ages. We need to be able to explain, the contours of our faith and do so in a way that's compelling and intelligible to others, okay? go back to Mere Christianity and C.S. Lewis if you need a refresher. Okay, that'll do. That'll be a good basis. So you need to be able to do that. And then, of course, there are particular theological issues we need to think through in the moment we're living. One is, some people think Donald Trump is a providential agent of the kingdom, and others think he's demonic and satanic. That's a key polarization in the United States just at the moment. And part of our work is the work of discernment and then the work of reconciliation. So that's part of this theological skill set one needs to learn in these moments. And then, of course, you do need to constantly engage with the task of, in the end, churches are in the business of sanctification. So what's that mean? It means you're in the business of being made holy. So what does that mean? It means that you're persons who actually appreciate that the Spirit of God is slowly making you Christ-like. Okay, now, in all those assertions, there's a theological understanding that's imperative. So I'll give you a very simple one. We too often as Episcopalians use the word love as something that everybody enthusiastically wants. Why can't we just love each other, A? And B, that's all we want, is a world where everybody loves each other. It's sort of Beatles. And don't knock the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles, I lived in Liverpool, okay? So, and of course, do you know, my assistant, Cassandra, this is 5 years ago, she's left now, she's late 20s, and I said to her, I alluded to All You Need Is Love by the Beatles, and she said, who are the Beatles? I was devastated. I just sat down in my office and wept. I didn't really, but I mean, I've just got to update my illustrations. Led Zeppelin, no, that wouldn't work. Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift could be the one. Yeah, exactly. But of course, the problem with emphasis on love is the truth is most of us don't want to be loving. That's what Lewis captures very, very well in The Great Divorce, if you know that book. The truth about love is it's really inconvenient. It means you've got to be kind. It means you're not allowed to use an expletive on the 81 when you're coming around the roadworks in Syracuse, and you're not allowed to gesture inappropriately to the driver that's just come out in front of you, right? That's what loving means. Loving means I'm tempted to buy a new pair of shoes, but I know somebody else needs resources, a gift, to enable them to survive. Loving means I am hurt by somebody, but I am going to forgive them. Loving, and most of us don't really want to be. It's quite nice being selfish. It's quite nice gossiping. That's called sin, okay? So in other words, the weird thing about theology is it's highly practical. You're constantly asking the question, okay, how can I be a person who better embodies the values of the God I worship in my life? How can I confront places where I haven't forgiven? How can I confront places where I really do quite like stuff, and even though I've got an awful lot of stuff already, I still want some more stuff? Do you know, I was reading the article this morning about the flying car. It was in the Wall Street Journal. Just to reassure you, I do read the New York Times, The Economist, and the Washington Post. And it's all about this flying car. And I sent a message to my wife saying, this is what I want for my birthday next year. It's $150,000. So the reply came back quite quickly. Not this year, dear. But it is just, more stuff. Okay. Stop thinking about stuff. Start thinking about giving.
Now, I know we're coming close to time, but we have some questions online. And do you have them? Oh, good. That's why Adam's on top of it. Here you go.
Oh, sure. Dr. Markham, on Zoom, Jerry Baratella wanted to ask, if I interpret it correctly, The argument against materialism is that since we can't and don't live as if it is true, that it must be false. He wanted to know your thoughts about that.
Actually, that's a good summary. That's, so it's not an entirely valid argument because, of course, it could still be true even though people find it impossible to live. So the next step in the argument needs to be as follows. I need to say, and the fact that every single person, you hope and pray, there might be some which are so depraved that they've lost this, but the vast majority of people, overwhelmingly majority of people, are persons who have discovered that love matters, are persons who have discovered that there are moments when they sit with art and music and they're lifted out of themselves, are persons who are aware the mind is different from brain, and they live life believing that reasoning makes sense because it isn't just an evolutionary trick. Given that that's true, then that's all evidence that at the heart of the universe is goodness and love, enabling everything that is and sustaining everything that is. That's a definition of God, if you like. And I do think that that is right. People can't live. Nietzsche is really interesting. So Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900s, German philosopher. And Nietzsche was the one who said, I'm an atheist. And the problems with modernity is they've not faced up to the implications of atheism, which is that reason no longer works, which is very paradoxical given he was using his, and morality doesn't exist. He said you have to redefine it. And so, I think Nietzsche was right. And most people don't live like Nietzscheans. And they don't, because in the end, they don't really believe that all we are complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere going nowhere. And therefore, that is good evidence that at the heart of the universe is intention, is love, that created this world and invites us to learn through life. The goal of life is very, very simple, to learn how to give and receive love. Easy to state, difficult to do. And that's the truth about who we are and why we're here.
Thank you. And then the last question, of course, we couldn't let you go if we don't ask about the new Archbishop of Canterbury and the reaction to her election. And do you have thoughts about that you would like to share?
I'm delighted. So the search, just to remind you all, I think technically, do they use the word election in the UK? Appointed, yeah, because of course what happens is there's a search committee which included Anglican Communion representatives, including Archbishop Hossam Naoum, who's the Archbishop in Jerusalem, Palestinian Christian. So it had global representation. Then they make a recommendation to 10 Downing Street, and then 10 Downing Street makes a recommendation to His Majesty the King, and then the King writes a letter. Dear Dame Macaulay, I need to learn how to say her name. I think this was an inspired appointment. I think it was a very, very good appointment. I think it was, they picked somebody who's wise and experienced, who've navigated a complex diocese of London. And she will be relatively short tenure. She's not young, but that'll be good too. There has been this reaction by some GAFCON bishops. But what was interesting about that reaction is that the GAFCON bishops, and there are 3 provinces which are very worried about this, which is Uganda, Nigeria, and Rwanda, they were basically inviting the rest of the Global South to join them. So it was a pitch. It was a pitch to Tanzania and Kenya and the Sudan. Now, both the seminaries I run have deep connections with alumni in those provinces. I think the pitch is going to fail. I don't see Tanzania jumping to join a GAFCON communion. So I'm actually relatively calm about what's happening just at the minute. In other words, I think we'll have a great archbishop. And I think her witness at this time will be really important. And I think that the majority of provinces which are currently involved in the communion will stay there. Because because it wasn't signed by all of them. They didn't have every primate of Tanzania, Sudan, signing this declaration. They were just being invited to join it. Well, okay, we need to make it clear that we hope they don't. And I trust the training we provided at our two institutions to make sure that there's sufficient resistance to joining, that they will stay in the Anglican communion as it currently is.
Thank you so much. I think we all want to thank Dr. Ian Markham for being with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.